VTI and VXUS are two really popular ETFs among US investors. And if you've spent any time reading about index trackers on the internet, you've probably come across them. The reason they're so popular is that VTI tracks the total US stock market, and VXUS tracks the total international stock market. So by combining them, you can get global coverage for a portfolio with two very low-cost index trackers. There's also VT, which tracks the total world stock market, but at 0.07%, it's more expensive than combining VTI and VXUS separately. We can still use VT for reference though, which I will come back to later, so it's worth knowing it exists. So why are VTI and VXUS not available to us in the UK? The reason we can't buy US registered ETFs like VTI and VSUX is because of EU and UK regulations. Basically, there are certain rules around how funds must operate before they can be sold to European retail investors. The most common type of UK authorised fund you'll see is UCITS, and this means that the fund has to meet certain minimum standards, like holding a diversified portfolio and publishing specific information about the fund. US listed ETFs don't have to meet these same standards, and that's why we can't buy VTI and VSUX. So what can we do instead? Unfortunately, we don't have any funds that are direct equivalents of VTI and VXUS. We can buy funds that track the US stock market, but there's no VXUS equivalent. We don't have a fund that tracks the total international stock market in the same way, so we have to split things slightly differently. A logical thing to wonder might be, okay, we can't do US and international, but could we do UK and international? Nearly. So we can buy a UK fund, and then we could combine it with something like this FTSE Developed World ex-UK index fund, which would give us control over how much of our portfolio we wanted to invest in the UK, and would be a low-cost way of doing it, because these funds are priced at 0.06 and 0.14% respectively. Yep, we don't get quite as low prices as the US funds here, but that's just how it is, unfortunately. Buying these two funds would also not give us any emerging markets or small cap exposure, so that's something we'd have to add separately if we wanted full global coverage and to replicate exactly what VTI and VXUS are doing. And here's a look at what that portfolio could look like. So this option is cheap, but not the simplest. A simpler two-fund split could be that instead of splitting by US and international, we could split by developing and emerging markets. You can do this with something like the iShares Core MSCI World ETF, and then the iShares Core MSCI Emerging Markets ETF. This gets us closer because the Emerging Markets ETF here actually includes small cap stocks. The Developed World one doesn't, but that means that you could just buy one extra small cap fund to make up that difference. And at 0.2% and 0.18% respectively, these funds are not quite as cheap as the previous option we looked at, but it does mean having to hold and rebalance fewer funds overall. So how do we know what proportion to give to emerging markets versus developed markets? Remember how I said that VT could be useful for something? Well, if we go and look at the portfolio composition of that fund, it shows us that it includes 10.1% emerging markets exposure. And so we can actually use that as a guide to tell us approximately what proportion of our portfolio we might want to devote to emerging markets. Alternatively, and this is the simplest option, but not the cheapest, you can also buy a single global fund, like the Vanguard FTSE Global All Cap Index Fund. At 0.23%, this is, as you can see, not the cheapest, but it does mean that there's zero rebalancing for you to do, or choosing how much to allocate to any region, which is good if you want a completely hands-off portfolio. If that sounds appealing, I talk about this fund and some other similar options in this video about single fund portfolios.